Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, the difference between a full-length album, an EP, a 7-inch, and explaining what runtime means on a CD. This is a special episode that I am dedicating to my subscriber, Luke. He is always asking me to explain what runtime means on a CD, and it's something that's kind of confusing. But I'll do my best to try to explain it. So Luke, this video is for you. But before we get to the runtime on CD, I thought I would go back and talk about with vinyl how time lengths of albums worked when it came to vinyl. With vinyl, you had limitations with the amount of music that you could put on a 12-inch vinyl record before the sound quality started to suffer. On a vinyl, and this is going to be hard to see on video, but you have grooves, and that's where the sound is inside the groove. And the more music you have, the smaller you have to make the grooves so that you can fit them into the space that you have. And if you notice here, there's your run out area. It's a little bit hard to see, but these are just clear grooves right here. When the needle gets to the end of the record, it just sits and continues to spin in the run out groove. So what happens, typically a vinyl record should be 20 minutes or less a side. Anything over 20 minutes, they say, starts to affect the sound quality. Now, there's a lot of factors that can play into that. Back in the day when they made vinyl, the factories that made the vinyl, you had professionals who would cut the lathe, I believe it was called, the stamper disc. So what they did was they got back in the day it was analog, so they would have the master tape. I'm pretty sure I talked about this with remixes and remasters, what goes on with when you're finally finished with everything, you make a master tape, that gets sent to be duplicated. Now, the guy at the record plant, he knows his machine, he knows how to set it so that he can get the best sound onto the record. And different places might cut things different ways. For instance, I have the same record, different pressings, and sometimes there's less run out groove or more run out groove because it depends on who was creating the record. They make a master stamper, and that's where they make that decision of, all right, how are we going to spread this out? And so then from that master stamper is where they make the copies of the rest of the vinyl records from. That's kind of an oversimplified version of how it's done. But so in other words, there was the guy at the record plant making that master disc, he had to make some judgment calls, deciding sometimes maybe if there was too much bass, they would cut a little bass so that it wouldn't cause the needle to jump or it wouldn't cause problems on the record, how far out to space the grooves and everything, depending on how much time they had on the record. An interesting little tidbit, you can usually see inside the run out groove, the guy who does that will often put like his initials or a marking on it. And there's some guys that did this that were famous, so when you see their Porky, for instance, and you see those markings on the inside, you know that they were cut at a certain place and everything with a certain quality, if you will. And okay, so when you put too much music on one side, it starts to affect the quality of the record. Now, I have some records that have up to 27 minutes of music on a side, and some of them sound pretty good, but what you're fighting against on a record is when you're on the outside of the record, you have a groove that's the 12 inches here, and as you move closer in, it gets smaller and smaller, and there's more, the dynamic range can suffer if it's not cut really well, so they try to avoid getting too close to the label here, because as grooves get smaller, it gets harder and harder to have good sound. A lot of times, even back in the day, an artist would have a quiet song on the end of the sides, because a quieter song has a little bit more space in it, and it was a little easier to deal with it on the inner groove. Sometimes they would even master things a little bit differently depending on where they thought it was going to be on the record. So typically a 12-inch record, which is what this is Dio's Lock Up the Wolves, is 20 minutes a side. You might get Van Halen was like 15 minutes a side. You know, 15 to 20 minutes a side was kind of the ideal time length for a full-length album. All right, then you have what's called a 12-inch single. So this is a 12-inch record, but it only has, it's got 2 songs on one side, and it's got 1 song on this side. So as you can see, this is about as much space run out, maybe a little bit more than it was on that other full-length record, but this is only 1 song on this side. So that means they were able to really open up these grooves. So this is going to sound really good because it's got nice wide grooves, plenty of space to put that 1 song on here. Here on the second side, they have 2 songs. So that's a 12-inch single. And a 12-inch single is usually based off of a 7-inch single, which is like this right here. So a 7-inch single is typically 1 song per side. And this has to play at 45 RPM. A 12-inch record, typically plays at 33 RPM. You can have records, 12-inch records, that play at 45. Like, in fact, that 12-inch single that I have there is probably 45. But almost always 7-inch singles are at 45 because of their smaller size. And they're typically 1 song. So you're talking 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 4 to 7 minutes at the most on the side of a 7-inch single. If I look at my 12-inch single, this is a 45 RPM. So you would play this at 45 RPM, so it would spin faster, which also helps with sound quality. When it's spinning faster, you get better sound quality. That's why sometimes you'll see these box sets, and they'll take an album that was a single record and they'll spread it across two albums, sometimes even 3 albums, so that you can spin it at 45, faster speed, better sound quality. You can only put one, and they'll only put 1 or 2 songs on a side, so they can really open up those grooves. Tons of space in the grooves, tons of dynamics and frequencies and everything like that. Those are like high fidelity, half-speed masters, things like that, and you usually have to pay a lot more for those records. All right, now EP is typically half the length of a normal album, so it's usually like about 10 to 12 minutes a side. This is a 4-song EP, 2 songs on a side. In the era of CDs, that sort of got thrown out the window, where an EP just became like whatever. I've seen things listed as EPs that were like 70 minutes long. I think EP almost became to mean something that you just sort of put out between proper albums. You know, an EP would have maybe 1 or 2 new songs on it, and then they just throw on a whole bunch of live cuts or something, but the whole time thing didn't apply once CDs came in. But a vinyl EP is typically, you know, roughly half the length of a normal vinyl record. All right, now when it comes to CDs, and this is for Luke out there, when it comes to CDs and Runtime, CDs are different. There's no CDs. You can fit 80 minutes of music onto a CD, and you don't have any sound quality. Doesn't suffer. It's the same if you have 1 minute or 80 minutes on the CD. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't affect the sound quality. That's with the WAV audio file. Now, if you have MP3s that are compressed files, yeah, I'm pretty sure you can put more time on it. But a store-bought CD, you can have like 79, 80 minutes of music on a store-bought CD. And what Luke often asks about is the runtime. And I believe what he's talking about, what he's referring to, is when a CD gets made, usually when it's mastered. Now go back to my mixing and mastering video. The engineer sets the time on when the song starts and when the song ends. So how much silence there is before the song starts, how much silence there is at the end of the song before it flips to the next track. If you have multiple copies of the same CD, sometimes you'll find that there's a little bit more space at the beginning or ends of certain songs, because that's a judgment call that's made by the engineer. Sometimes, the band may have a say in that. Sometimes if there's two songs that are meant to segue one immediately into the other, there won't be any space, and you'll just see your CD, the track number will change right when it comes to the next CD. Now, the time can vary because you have a little bit of time at the beginning and at the end of the song that they make this judgment on how much time they want to put at the beginning or the end. And so sometimes when you look at different versions of CDs, the song can be a couple seconds longer or shorter depending on which version you have, depending on how they cut it, or, how they did it on the CD, how much space they left between it. In fact, there's the early days of CDs, sometimes songs that were meant to segue, they just this is in the very early days of the CDs, they would accidentally just automatically put like a 2 or 3 second space, and it just would kill the flow of it. Think of like Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon or something, where a lot of those songs just roll, or The Wall, that they roll one right into each other. To have a gap in it is just, insane. It takes away from the flow of it. So it's sort of a judgment call. And sometimes what happens, all right, well, let's go back for a second. You also have on a CD player, your different CD players also read the time slightly differently. So sometimes older CD players aren't as accurate as newer CD players, or the way it's reading it is not 100% accurate. So you can get a second or two difference here and there. Some CD players will even give you a countdown to when the next song starts. Some CD players, and this has to be encoded in the CD, where the information like the song title and the artist name is encoded in the CD. And if your CD player can do this, you might have a display that reads across and tells you what the song is, how much time there is. Some CD players give you a countdown, how much is left, or some just tell you how far you are into the song. It varies by CD player, and of course things can be off by a second or two here and there. So it's not an exact science. CD players can be sort of fussy sometimes. The other thing is that sometimes where they decide to cut the song can be an issue of debate. I'll give you a good example of this, where this was just done incorrectly and it drove people crazy. I think it's on the original, the first remasters of Iron Maiden's Power Slave, where right before the song Power Slave comes in, the song before it, they put the beginning of the song, which is most people consider the beginning of Power Slave to be the laughter, the well, they tagged that on to the song right before it, which is, I forget what the song is before it. Is it Back in the Village, maybe? Or The Duelist? I can't remember now the song right before Power Slave. But they tagged that on to the end of that. So if you're on your CD player, you jumped ahead to Power Slave, all you heard was dun 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 dun. It just started right on that. And that drove, hardcore fans crazy, because you're like, that's not the laughter thing and the drum fill, that's the beginning of the song. And that would happen kind of a lot. Like Black Sabbath's first album, the song NIB, A Bit of Finger, all that stuff, it's all confusing. Like, people, where do some of those songs begin and end? And there's some CD versions where they tried to separate those. I think the latest ones, they just put them all together like they were originally intended on the original album to be like all part of like basically NIB, A Bit of Finger, they just sort of put them all together on one track then. So there's some, sometimes things can get messed up where something can get cut off, or the track changes at the wrong time where they put the cut in. But basically, that's just an error on the part of the the engineer, some of the guy who was, mastering the CD somewhere along the line with that. So, all right, so there you go. There's the explanation of runtime. Again, it's something that can vary depending on the CD player, depending on how the CD was made. So a second here, a second there. It can be affected in a whole bunch of different ways. It's not always an exact science. And sometimes the real hardcore fans, they get up in arms when they're like, wait a minute, why is this 5 seconds longer on this CD and 5 seconds shorter on another, And another thing that they did in the early days of CDs was sometimes things would get cut off early, like there'd be a note getting held out or something, and they would just trim it off early, and this kind of thing would drive people crazy. So runtime is not an exact science, but it's basically program, it's encoded into the CD there by the people who are mastering or engineering the CD, preparing it to be duplicated. And depending on your CD player, the time can vary ever so slightly. All right, so that's runtime. And then we got our explanation of a 7-inch, typically one song on a side, 45 RPM, about 5 to 7 minutes or so. 12-inch single, same thing. Sometimes they'll add 2 songs onto a side, gives you a little bit of extra dynamic range because you can spread those songs out. Oh, and I forgot an EP. I forgot to mention an EP record. And then, of course, you have a full-length vinyl, which is typically try to keep it around 20 minutes, give or take, so that the sound quality doesn't get affected. All right, so there you go. Luke, there's your explanation of CD runtime. And for everybody out there, a little bit of a breakdown of the difference between these different types of vinyl records and dealing with the lengths of CDs and how all that changed and varied in the CD age. Now, in the cassette age, this is a good question. I don't know the answer to this. I know I have some cassette fans out there. I don't know if there was a time limit on how much you could put in a cassette. I mean, I know getting double albums that were on single cassettes and you'd see all the tape inside there. So there had to be some kind of limit, and that's a good question. Who knows the answer to that out there? How much time were you able to possibly put on a cassette tape? I mean, I know 90-minute blank tapes, I think, were the longest blank tapes. I don't know. Let me know. I know I have some cassette fans out there. Let me know in the comments down below. And how about people out there with 8-tracks? What was some of these double albums on 8-tracks? How much time? Who knows how much? That's really a digging deep with trivia here. So let me know in the comments down below if anybody has any thoughts, any insights on this kind of stuff. Thanks for listening, and until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.